Hi everyone, my name is Liz Elborn. I use they, she pronouns, and I am a gender and social justice student at Trent University. This is my big research project for my final year research seminar, and I'm going to be talking to you today about the eugenics movement in Alberta. Before getting into anything, I would like to put a content warning. This podcast will be dealing with difficult information about eugenics, colonialism, racism, sexism, and forced sterilization, which has been declared an act of torture by the UN. If at any time you're struggling with what you're listening to, please take a break. Please feel free to skip parts or even to just stop listening if you need. A lot of my work on this project included self-care activities like getting out into nature to reflect and tons of puppy cuddles. Please take care of yourselves. So I will be focusing particularly on revealing how gender, disability, and Indigenous status interact within the eugenics movement, especially in the involuntary sterilization of 2,822 people under the Alberta Sexual Sterilization Act that was passed in 1928. For those who do not know, sterilization is when a person's body is surgically altered so that they cannot have children. In men, this is usually done by vasectomy, whereas in women, in the past, it was usually done by salpingectomy, which is when the fallopian tubes are removed, but now it is usually done through tubal ligation, or more commonly known as getting one's tubes tied. To start off, I would like to orient myself within the knowledge that I am presenting. I am a settler of Irish-Italian descent. I don't know much about my family history, but I do know that we've been in Canada for a long time, though I don't know exactly how long. I am queer and disabled as a femme-aligned non-binary person who identifies as queer and has ADHD. I was first introduced to eugenics in my first year gender and social justice class through Nadia Kanani's 2011 article entitled Race and Madness, Locating the Experiences of Racialized People with Psychiatric Histories in Canada and the United States. I got to explore this more later in my Foundations for Indigenous History and Feminism Disability classes. I started my research into eugenics and forced sterilization in my final assignment from my Indigenous Histories class, and this brought me to Karen Stote's work, which I will look at more in detail later. This is a topic that I am very passionate about because of my connection to it as a disabled person, but also because there is relatively little work that looks at the complexities of oppression within eugenics, thinking, and action. My aim in doing this podcast is to make this knowledge more accessible since it's mostly existing in the academic realm, hidden behind paywalls and academic jargon. Next, I would like to acknowledge the land where this project was put together. I've been working out of the territory of the Mississaugas of Schoolgog Island First Nation, covered under Williams Treaty in the province of Ontario. I often struggle to grapple with what it means to occupy land that was obtained unethically and to live on land while the community that it was taken from is still fighting for sovereignty and respect for their personhood. Further, what it means to live in and support a city that is actively involved in the colonization of landscape through not only development, but also through conservation. Honestly, it is really difficult to think about, but so important if we're going to forge alliances in good faith in the future. I also think a lot about the ways that I contribute to ongoing history, including through the participation in academics, where written knowledge of white European men is valued above all other forms of knowledge. Creating this podcast to me feels like a good step in breaking the tradition of valuing written knowledge above oral knowledges that are an integral part of Indigenous knowledge dissemination and indeed essential to the knowledge dissemination of my pagan ancestors. I also aim to decolonize this knowledge by making it accessible to anyone who is interested in exploring, taking it out of the private academic realm and into the public realm. I will start off this analysis by answering the following questions. What is eugenics, and why was eugenics so popular that it made its way into legislation? Eugenics is a coin termed by Francis Galton in 1883 that focuses on the science of heredity and concerns itself with protecting the health of the nation. If you've ever heard of Darwin's theory of survival of the fittest, basically eugenics is survival of the fittest but applied to humans. Caulfield and Robertson note that eugenics works on the understanding that some traits are hereditary, which means that they are passed down from one generation to the next through reproduction, and that these traits are socially undesirable. Eugenicists believe that people with these undesirable traits have higher reproductive rates than other people and are more likely to be a burden on the state. People with these undesirable traits were categorized as feeble-minded. This term is defined as someone who is mentally defective with a low level of intelligence, or someone who is weak and unable to make decisions. Nobody can really give a true answer as to who fits into the category of feeble-minded because it was applied to so many different people for so many different reasons. Essentially, feeble-minded people were understood to be people who did not conform to hegemonic ideals of personhood. This could mean that they had mental illness, had a disability, were poor, or were deviant. And deviance could include anything from being a prostitute to having a baby out of wedlock, or even just disobeying the orders of an Indian agent. If you notice, much of what was considered feeble-minded falls under social constructions of race and morality. Caulfield and Robertson remark that it was easier for the middle class to perceive social problems as the faults of individuals rather than as caused by society's oppressive nature. Locating social issues within individuals diminishes government responsibility for social issues and allows for these individuals to be further marginalized. In the case of eugenics, this allowed for the implementation of negative eugenics through the institutionalization and sterilization of those deemed feeble-minded, and resulted in acts such as the Sexual Sterilization Acts that were implemented in Alberta and BC from the 1920s to the 1970s. I would like to take the time to acknowledge the nations whose traditional territory is located in what we now know as Alberta. Alberta is covered under 5 of the number treaties. These are Treaty 4, Treaty 6 of 1876, Treaty 7, Treaty 8, and Treaty 10. I'm going to focus on Ponoka and Red Deer because this is where the Alberta Mental Hospital and the Provincial Training School were located. And these were the 2 leading feeder institutions for the Eugenics Board. I had a really difficult time finding information about whose traditional territory were in Ponoka and Red Deer, and I think this really speaks to the erasure of Indigenous histories in settler society and the impacts that this has had on knowledge transfer. From what I could find, Ponoka and Red Deer were traditionally territory of Blackfoot, Cree, and Métis nations, and today the closest Indigenous communities to Ponoka and Red Deer are the 4 nations that make up Masquachits. These are the Montana First Nation, the Lewis Bull Tribe, Samson Cree Nation, and the Ermineskin Cree Nation. Masquachits means Bear Hills, named because the land used to be covered in blueberry bushes, which attracted a large bear population. In 1891, the area was named Hobbema by settlers after a Dutch painter. But the Masquachits Cree reclaimed the traditional name for the territory in 2013, which with the name officially taking effect in January 1st of 2014. This is a good step in the direction of reclamation and decolonization. So now I want to focus on Alberta's Sexual Sterilization Act. Caulfield and Robertson provide context behind the act in their 1996 article, which is what I will be using to conceptualize the act here. The act was passed in 1928 and was influenced by eugenic policies in the United States, beginning with Indiana's eugenic sterilization legislation in 1907. Many groups advocated for eugenic sterilization, including first-wave feminists, which I will explore more later, and the intention of the act was to reduce the amount of people that the government was responsible for. The act aimed to discharge mentally defective peoples from institutions if they would not be considered harmful to the public after their sterilization. The Eugenics Board was appointed in order to oversee the sterilization program and approve sterilizations under the Act. In her book, Erica Dick explains that the Eugenics Board would approve sterilizations that when they felt there was a, quote, danger to the transmission of any mental disability or deficiency to offspring or a risk of mental injury to such persons or to the progeny if sterilization were not carried out. During the time the Act was in place, there were 2 amendments. One was in 1937 and the other in 1942. The 1937 amendment differentiated between psychotic people and mental defectives, with the board no longer requiring consent of mental defectives to sterilize them. Caulfield and Robertson explain that the 1942 amendments expanded the power of the eugenics board to authorize sterilization. This included cases of neurosyphilis, epilepsy with psychosis or mental deterioration, and Huntington's chorea. Consent was required in these cases except for an individual with Huntington's chorea who was also psychotic. Importantly, Stowe reveals that in 1942, the 1942 amendment also made it so that no person who took place in administering or recommending the sterilization could have civil action taken against them. Amy and Rowlands report that the Alberta Eugenics Board only spent 13 minutes on average deliberating cases that were brought before them. They're quoted saying, the board approved 4,725 of 4,800 cases brought before them. They put off decisions for the rest and never said no. Of those 4,725 cases that were approved, 2,822 sterilizations were performed in Alberta before the Sexual Sterilization Act was repealed in 1972. Next, I want to talk about gender in the eugenics movement. Execution of eugenics was heavily gendered. Reproduction is largely understood to be women's responsibility, and because of this, gender is deeply entrenched in eugenics issues. Eugenics concerns itself with limiting procreation of those understood to be unfit. Therefore, it makes sense that it would largely target women because of their assumed sole responsibility for pregnancy. I'm going to explore the ways that this plays out in Alberta's Sexual Sterilization Act. So let's start off with the way that first-wave feminists were involved in the implementation of the Sexual Sterilization Act. In her 2008 article, Grekel talks about how many of eugenics supporters were women. This included famous suffragettes such as Nellie McClung and Emily Murphy, as well as groups such as the United Farm Women of Alberta. If we look simplistically, first-wave feminism was largely built on the idea that white women are responsible for the continuation of the race, and for this reason, they needed more rights, like the right to vote and personhood, for example. And this was to better accomplish their aims of continuation of the white race, essentially. With this understanding, it is likely that first-wave feminists were strong supporters of eugenics because they wanted to protect the rights that white women had gained. They likely did not want to risk being grouped with people who were understood to reproduce irresponsibly. Therefore, they wanted to ensure that this irresponsible reproduction did not happen. As I explored earlier, it was understood that much of feeble-mindedness was considered hereditary and thus passed down through reproduction. This means that people who were considered feeble-minded were seen as reproducing irresponsibly because they would pass on their feeble-mindedness to their children. Now, of course, we know this isn't true, and instead, a lot of what was conceptualized as feeble-mindedness was actually social problems that were being blamed on individuals to take responsibility away from the government. For example, poverty is not hereditary, but instead a result of poor social policy that allows people to be undervalued and continues generally because there's a lack of system change and unequal access to opportunity. As Caulfield and Robertson explore, it was much easier for the middle class to perceive social problems as the fault of individuals rather than the government, and this likely plays into why many feminists were for eugenics, as they were mostly white middle-class women. Interestingly, white middle-class women were also big proponents of the birth control movement, which was also founded on eugenic principles and targeted poor and racialized communities for the implementation of birth control programs. This is another interesting aspect of eugenics, and I wanted to mention it, but I'm not really going to be able to explore it further because my project specifically focuses on sterilization under the Sexual Sterilization Act in Alberta. So moving on to the way that sterilization was gendered under the Sexual Sterilization Act in Alberta, let's start with statistics. Grekel Greco notes that most of the files containing details about those sterilized were destroyed in 1987, leaving only about 20% of the files remaining. From the remaining files, 54% of the cases presented to the Eugenics Board were women, compared to 46% men, and of those presented, 64% of women and 54% of men were sterilized. Further, women made up 58% of those sterilized under the Act. So these numbers show a bias of people in power for referring women for sterilization, as well as a bias of the board to approve cases that involved women. Greco also notes that women were more likely to be sterilized for violating norms of femininity, which, quote, made them risky to themselves or society's moral order. The norms of femininity that were violated often revolved around sexuality, and women were often brought before the board for having multiple sexual partners outside of marriage and illegitimate children. 32% of the existing female case files from the 1930s mention promiscuity as part of their write-up, compared to 29% of male cases. This shows a focus on sexuality in both genders regarding sterilization. However, by 1950, quote, there are only 3 cases of recorded promiscuity for males, while promiscuity emerges as a theme in 26% of female cases. Of note, when there was no sexual deviance reported, sometimes potential for sexual deviance would be recorded in a file. This happened in 10% of female cases. It's also important to consider how much attention was paid to sexuality in patient files. The average write-up for female sexual history was more than double that of the write-up for male sexual history. Further, everything from ethnicity to abuse by husbands was included as part of women's sexual history write-ups. Many of the people brought before the Eugenics Board were poor, and poverty itself was sexualized. Greco notes that poor women were understood to, quote, have the most uncontrollable sexual urges, and thus their sexuality was subject to state control through sterilization. This also gives reason behind why women were likely overrepresented in those who were sterilized, because they were understood to be responsible for irresponsible reproduction and the presumed, quote, imminent downfall of the human race. I am sure I don't need to mention how messed up and wrong that is. I find it interesting. I also find it interesting that only of the case files that survived, only 38% have a family history of mental disorder, and 15% mention the family history, such as alcoholism or physical health, in the file. The case files actually suggest that mental disorders were not hereditary, with 46.7% showing no family history of quote unquote feeble-mindedness that would have been passed down to the person recommended for sterilization. The next topic I would like to explore is Indigenous people and sterilization under the Act. One of the groups particularly targeted by Alberta's Sexual Sterilization Act were Indigenous women. Karen Stoat was one of the first people to explore this in depth. The targeting of Indigenous women under the Act connects to colonization and goals of assimilating Indigenous peoples. Stoat explains that when Canada became its own nation-state, the Canadian government inherited treaty responsibilities to Indigenous populations from Britain. The Canadian government saw these responsibilities as too costly and in the way of capitalist expansion. To resolve this, Canadian governments have consistently tried to eschew their responsibilities and implement assimilationist policies so that there are less Indigenous people that they are responsible for. The Indian Act of 1876 was a big part of this, giving the government more control over Indigenous peoples, aiming to contain, civilize, and assimilate them. This was done through the outlawing of many legal, coalition building, and spiritual practices, prohibiting women from engaging in politics, limiting the number of Indigenous peoples by narrowing the definition of Indian, reducing Indigenous women to the property of their husbands, the imposition of patrilineal systems that disconnect Indigenous women from their lands, and putting a ban system in place. All of this aimed to make Indigenous populations more like settler populations and get Indigenous people to mix in with settler society. Many of these policies targeted Indigenous women specifically, including an 1898 amendment to the Indian Act which quote, stipulated that any women who bore a child out of wedlock or deserted her family was no longer considered an Indian and would no longer fall under federal responsibility. Further, Stoat notes that a 1927 amendment, quote, stipulated that any illegitimate child could be excluded from membership of a band by the Superintendent General at any time. These two amendments were very clearly aimed at disconnecting Indigenous women and their children from their culture and communities, forcing them to assimilate into settler society. This context of assimilation is the one in which Alberta's Sexual Sterilization Act is born, and is thus no surprise that it played a role in furthering the aim of assimilating Indigenous peoples. Morganson talks about colonization and the implementation of colonial masculinity, but his work has a lot to offer to this discussion. He explains that colonizers saw Indigenous genders as a threat to heteropatriarchy because they were not binary and because there was no one nature of sex, gender, or sexuality within Indigenous communities. Settlers, on the other hand, believed that there was only one natural and moral way for sex, gender, and sexuality to be performed. Settlers saw Indigenous women's sexual agency, in particular, as a site of conflict in need of controlling. This explains why the Indian Act focused so heavily on controlling the ways that Indigenous women express their sexuality and choose to have their families. Morganson notes that the government desired to study, control, or cure people that they saw as going against the moral order of civilization. The Sexual Sterilization Act was one of the ways that the Alberta government controlled and punished Indigenous women's reproduction. This lines up with Greckel's findings that most of the women who were sterilized under the Act were sterilized because of sexual deviance or potential for sexual deviance. With this understanding, it is clear that sterilization was used as a tool for punishing Indigenous women's sexuality, which was considered a site of conflict by settler populations. So now that we have an understanding of the why, let's talk about the numbers and amendments to the Indian Act that aided governments in sterilization efforts. Greckel and colleagues reveal that Indigenous people made up 2 to 3% of Alberta's overall population during the time that the Sexual Sterilization Act was in place, but made up over 6% of cases presented to the Eugenics Board. Stoat also notes that between 1969 and 1972, when there was fear that the Sexual Sterilization Act was going to be repealed, Indigenous people made up 25% of those sterilized. Greckel and colleagues also note that patient consent was only sought in 17% of Indigenous cases, and that 74% of Indigenous people brought before the board were sterilized compared to 60% of all patients presented to the board. Stoat notes that the federal government was not directly involved in the sterilizations that took place in Alberta under the Act, and that the Department of Indian Affairs was worried that these sterilizations resembled genocide, and they were concerned about the implications that this could have. They asked the Eugenics Board to attempt to get consent in all cases involving Indigenous peoples, and yet still consent was only sought in 17% of cases. While the federal government may not have been directly involved in these sterilizations, Stoat reveals that they certainly made sterilization easier to carry out. As in 1951, they amended the Indian Act to allow provinces to define what constituted a mentally incompetent Indigenous person, and thus allow any provincial law dealing with mental incompetence to apply to Indigenous peoples. The amendment also, quote, also stipulated that the property of any mental incompetent Indian could be denied to that person. This meant that the land that any Indigenous person deemed mentally incompetent had would be passed to the Ministry of Indian Affairs to be sold by the minister if they lived on reserve, and would be passed to the province if they lived off reserve. So not only does this diminish the Canadian government responsibility of care to Indigenous peoples, but also incentivizes diagnosing Indigenous people as mentally incompetent as a tool for capitalist and colonial expansion. The next thing that needs examining is the tools that were used to justify this disproportionate application of the Sexual Sterilization Act on Indigenous peoples. So as we have explored, social issues such as poverty and illness were not only understood to be individual failings rather than societal failings, but also understood to be hereditary. One of the ways that this was established was through IQ testing. Sampson explores how, as teachers and nurses at outposts, settler women were expected to identify and report children with mental deficiencies to authorities. The way they would do this was by using IQ testing in the classroom. Teachers were given the opportunity to take psychology classes to educate them on how to administer these tests, and nurses were required to take a psychology class focused on mental hygiene following Alberta's Public Health Nurses Act of 1919. Sampson further notes that between 1931 and 1960, school staff in Alberta referred 5,926 children to mental hygiene clinics to determine if they were, quote, mentally defective. This is to say that IQ testing was a really big part of determining who would be sterilized under the Sexual Sterilization Act. Stoute notes that IQ tests have been debunked as inaccurate representations of intelligence because they were designed specifically for Western Europeans. This meant that Indigenous peoples were more likely to fail IQ tests and thus more likely to be referred for a diagnosis of mental deficiency. Stoute also notes that ill health was common on reserves because Indigenous medicines were banned and because of government regulations that limited their success within society. She reveals that many of the Indigenous women who went to the hospital for pregnancy were found to be severely malnourished, and that children born with vitamin deficiencies have IQ levels 20 to 40% lower than average. This shows that government policy that perpetuated poverty and ill health in Indigenous communities put Indigenous children especially at risk of being diagnosed as mentally incompetent and thus increased their chances of being sterilized under Alberta's Sexual Sterilization Act. Moreover, Stoute exposes the eugenics board's tendency to repeat IQ tests when patients they wanted to sterilize passed them. This was in hopes that their scores would eventually be low enough to justify sterilization. With the way that the province was incentivized to deem Indigenous peoples mentally incompetent, it is likely that they would have been primary targets for this tactic. In all, IQ testing was a way to justify understanding that social problems were individual failings and work to determine who was eligible for sterilization under Alberta's Sexual Sterilization Act. So in this last section, I want to talk about after the Sexual Sterilization Act and kind of like what's going on and what the situation is now. So after Alberta's Sexual Sterilization Act was repealed, there was a lot of people who sought reparations for what happened to them. The most well-known is Leilani Muir, who sued the Alberta government and was in court between 1989 and 1995. The Alberta government ended up admitting wrongdoings, but blamed this on inadequate IQ testing that led to her sterilization rather than accepting responsibility for harmful eugenics policies. She was awarded $740,780 for wrongful confinement and sterilization, but this could never make up for the impacts that sterilization had on her life. After Muir's case, 635 other claims were settled out of court by 1999, and after this, 246 additional claims were settled. Stoute quotes Premier Klein's pitiful 1999 apology that goes something like this. I guess we extend regrets for the actions of another government in another period of time. It's unfortunate, I won't say criminal. It was the law at that particular time, and unfortunately, it was a bad law. That is probably the worst apology that I have ever heard. There is no admittance of wrongdoing, no accountability, and above all, the tone is one of dismissal, as though people's experiences just don't matter. I'm not even one of the victims of this act, and I'm completely outraged that this was considered an acceptable apology by the Premier. I feel that this is made worse by the fact that sterilization abuse was still ongoing while Premier Klein was in office, and indeed, it still is. Pat Taylor, a former social worker at the Provincial Training School in Red Deer, Alberta, reported in an interview that Ponoka Mental Hospital was still sterilizing Indigenous children in the 1980s. To this day, Indigenous women continue to be targets for sterilization abuse in Canada. Alyssa Lombard is heading up a class action lawsuit on behalf of Saskatchewan women who have been forcibly and coercively sterilized since the 1970s. Since she started her work, women from all over Canada, including Alberta, have come forward with their stories and are seeking justice. In a study on long-term birth control methods, Morgan found that Indigenous women disproportionately report using Depo-Provera, otherwise known as the needle. This suggests that there is a targeting of Indigenous women for long-term birth control methods. The National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls has also pointed to forced sterilization as one of the many ways that genocide has been committed against Indigenous people. The UN Committee on Torture has also recognized that forced sterilization of Indigenous women is a form of torture, and they have given Canada recommendations for investigating, preventing, punishing, and providing reparations for victims of forced or coerced sterilization. Despite this, forced sterilization has not been outlawed in Canada, and provisions that could be used to hold people accountable have not been used to hold people accountable. Thus, after the act, sterilization abuse is still existent in Canada. Victims have seen nothing more than half-hearted, empty apologies, and not much has been done by the Canadian government to ensure the safety of groups disproportionately targeted by sterilization abuse. So this is super dismal, but I want to end off on a positive note. There has been a lot of activism taken up by Indigenous women and their communities against sterilization abuse. In 2019, Indigenous women and their allies got together for a rally to end sterilization abuse. Both the Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission have included calls to action and justice for sterilization abuse. And as I mentioned earlier, Alyssa Lombard is representing Indigenous women in a class action lawsuit against the Saskatchewan government. Further, there is increased awareness of the issue, which helps to put pressure on governments to make a change to legislation. With this increase of recognition and activist work being taken up, there is a lot of hope for the healthcare system to not participate in sterilization abuse of any groups and be a safe space for all people in Canada. So thank you for taking the time to listen to my presentation. I hope you made it through okay and learned something along the way. Please make sure to do some self-care after sitting through this heavy topic, and I know I will be doing the same. Have a great day, guys.